So good evening, everyone. I now call this regular meeting of the Board of Education to order at 7:20 p.m. We'll take a moment of silence to be followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'll have the coordinator call the roll.
Mr. Dixon?
Present.
Mr. Rollins?
Here.
Mr. Scrivano?
Here.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Here.
Mr. Siegel?
Here.
Mr. Connor?
Here.
Ms. Stanford?
Here.
With 7 present, we have a quorum.
Okay, as you may have heard, we had set aside time tonight for any public hearing comments on the adoption of the fiscal year 2021 tentative budget, and we have no public speakers. And we do not have any public speakers to talk during the petitions and communications portion of our meeting. So I will ask at this time if there are any board member comments, and remind board members to introduce yourself before you speak, and I'll call on you. Any board member comments?
Yeah, this is David.
Go ahead, David.
So coincidentally, today I was out walking and ran across a small batch or gaggle, maybe it's a murder of teachers from RISA, who they were congregating, planning to go do their parade that they had at the school. And they all commented that they felt like the transition to the remote learning worked very well for them, and it worked progressively better as the weeks went on. And they were grateful for the feeling supported by the administration. When I saw them coming, I recognized a couple of them, and I was immediately but was very pleasantly surprised that they were speaking with very glowing terms of the administration and how things have gone for their particular portion of the universe.
Great, thank you. Good to hear. Any other board members that have comments? Okay, hearing none, we'll go ahead and move on to the consent portion of our agenda, including the following: the meeting minutes from May 12th, 2020, payroll, accounts payable, purchase orders for fiscal year 20, purchase order for fiscal year 21, and the following bid recommendation for Hillman School boiler upgrades, the recurring contract for the Running Start memorandum of understanding with Rock Valley College, the consolidated contracts for personnel services for various special ed positions, the other consent items including the prevailing wage resolution, the monthly cash and investment report, the property casualty student accident program liability insurance renewal, the financial results through April of 2020, the resolution and notice of public hearing on fund balance transfers, and the Freedom of Information Law. Is there a motion and a second to approve these consent items?
So moved. This is
Moved by Mr. Connor.
Second.
Second by Mr. Rollins. Any comments or questions? Or are there any items that board members would like to have pulled for separate consideration? Hearing none, I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the consent items.
Mr. Dixon?
Yes.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
yes.
Ms. Stanford?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. We'll now move on to our closed session consent items, and the following appointments for John Smeltzer as a 10-month assistant principal at Ellis Elementary School, the appointment of Gerald Scott Erdman as the 11-month principal at Conklin Elementary School, the appointment of Jason Barthel as Chief Information Officer, and the HR organizational report and addendum. Is there a motion and a second to approve these closed session consent items?
So moved. This is
Moved by Mr. Connor,
Second, this is Mr.
Second.
Siegel.
Siegel. Are there any closed session consent items that board members wish to have pulled for separate consideration? Hearing none, I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the closed session consent items.
Mr. Rollins,
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano,
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch,
Yes.
Mr. Siegel,
Yes.
Mr. Connor,
yes.
Ms. Stanford,
Yes.
Mr. Dixon.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay, we'll move on to our
Ken?
next agenda item, which is the, oh, Mr.
Ken?
Siegel?
Before we move on, it's not very often that we have a person whose position that we have voted on and approved in attendance. And I want to recognize Mr. Barthel for the great work that he's done and for the new position that we just voted on. And I have to say, that was hands down the coolest resume that I've ever seen, both in format and content.
I
I-
did.
I have never read a 7-page resume before, but it was not only beautiful to look at, it was actually enjoyable to read. Very well.
That's all that military training, right, Jason?
Man, good stuff.
Okay.
Definitely agree.
All right. All right. So thank you, David. Appreciate that input. The superintendent's report is next. Dr. Jarrett.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I'll be sharing my report with Brooke Peterson, who is going to be sharing part of the second part of the report, and I will do the first 12 slides here. And what we're doing while Mrs. Peterson pulls up the slides, I'm going to just remind the board that we have been working since last spring on something called academic return on investment, which is really about our board approval process and how we monitor and try to make sure that we are spending our resources on what works and what does the most good for goal 1 and for student achievement. And so we're going to spend some time on that. The other part of the work with the district management group that we've been doing for over a year was what's called strategic budgeting, and that was building level work, and you saw that with building level budgets. So for tonight's meeting, I'm going to be talking to you just a little bit of a high level overview to start with. So if we can skip to the the fourth slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what academic ROI is again. I think a good way to say academic ROI is it's really about making sure with our very limited time and with our money that we focus on what matters the most for our students. And if you think about a $450 million budget in 41 schools, you run the risk of trying to think about measuring thousands of initiatives. And what we're proposing with this work is by setting some priorities, there are some topics that you might want to spend 8 or 10 meetings really setting up how we're going to measure success. And we're going to talk about tier 3 academic ROI initiatives. Then there are some other that sometimes you can go through 8 or 10 topics in one meeting. And what we have found in the past is when we spread our focus too thin, there are some risks. And I just want to give an overview of what some of those risks are. So if we could change the slide. You know, limited time, limited resources, and a $450 million budget. So the first core risk is not focusing our time on what matters most and making sure that we do that. And just to review that a little bit further, we'll go to the next slide. When you lack focus as an organization, there's an old cliche that you can feel like the river is a mile wide, but only an inch deep. And we want to really go deep with certain things, the things that we think are the most valuable. And we've talked about some of those things already, and we're going to give you an update on one of those 3 in much greater detail. We're going to talk about our freshman academy concept. You also run the risk of continuing to add new initiatives, and sometimes you can duplicate those initiatives in a big system like ours, or you can add new ones without even really measuring if what you're doing now fully works. So it's a kind of an organizational discipline of slowing down a little bit. And another problem with adding and adding and adding is you can really frustrate the schools. If you change a lot of things, you get what's called initiative fatigue, and people feel bombarded with new ideas. And there's often an old cliche in education that says, this too shall pass. So that can be a result of a lack of focus. And ultimately, you can get into compliance rather than measuring quality with what we're doing. So what we're attempting to introduce and reintroduce to the board with the three-tiered PDSA framework is that we are going to get better at focusing together. We're going to be using our committee work, we're going to be using our board report schedule, and we're going to be using a team that we've created to make sure we are really measuring what works and doing a good job of focusing so that we can have better results for student achievement. So if we can skip to the three-tier PDSA framework, I want to remind you what each of the tiers are about. So let's start with tier 1.
Mrs. McCulloch, I would ask if you could mute. We're getting some background noise from your birds. Thank you.
So tier 1s are managed at the department level, and they are consent approval. There are significantly more tier 1s than anything else. And these still come to the board for approval if they're over $10,000, these still come to the board for your approval. But these are things that we really, as we look at our annual budgeting process, which is a tool, we really expect our department heads or our principals or people at that level to be managing these initiatives. Shifting into tier 2, this is something we're going to introduce that is new tonight. We've started with tier 3, and tier 2, these are kind of the initiatives that are going to be our future tier 3 initiatives. These could have been selected. These were under consideration, and these are things we think the board should hear a lot about over the course of the year. These involve multiple departments. They involve a great deal of money in many cases. They can impact multiple schools. And we think of this as the next group of initiatives to be in line to get the full academic ROI study. We only do 3 of those a year in tier 3. And we've given the board a list to start with that we want you to think about a little bit. And then we're going to ask you to spend some time talking to us about what we should do to make changes to that list at our committee of the whole meeting next. But I wanted to give you some time to think about that tonight. Moving on to tier 3, these you will remember are selected by the board, and we spend time designing these. They have the most impact. They impact the most departments, and they are often huge dollar amounts and have a huge impact on goal 1. And just to remind you of what we selected back in the fall when we talked about this, if I can flip to the next slide, you'll remember that we said, hey, we gave you a list of 7 or 8 that we narrowed down. And the board ultimately said, hey, we really are concerned about our on-track rate for freshmen and our academic achievement at the high school level. So let's really and we're spending a ton of time and effort on this freshman academy. And that's actually the example we're going to walk you through, because that was the first one we've been working on. We are currently building the studies for Reading Horizons, which obviously is an extremely important investment our district's making because it contributes to how we teach reading, which is foundational to our success as a district. And finally, we thought it was important to look at some of the positions that we invest in at the school level that are part of the menu that principals can order from. So we're doing we decided to pick, we gave you 2 different positions, and the board ultimately selected the behavioral intervention specialist position. And so we're going to do that analysis. So those are the 3 that we're studying this year. And again, tonight, Brooke is going to walk you through Freshman Academy. If you look at the tier 2 list, and I will resend this to you, but these 6 categories just happen to be how we brought these together. But if you look at the dashes, that is the list. And we purposely didn't go all the way up to 20 because we wanted to leave some room if the board wanted to add some, or if we end up investing in new initiatives over time. But these are some of the investments we thought were worthy of the board's consideration. What we want you to think about with this list, and again, I will send this out to you tonight, is on this list, is there something that shouldn't be on the list? Or as you look at this list and you think about the tier 3 list, is there something that we didn't include that we need to make sure we include. We really want your help with that, and we think the committee of the whole is a great time to have that conversation. So if you think there's a position we missed, or if you think there's a teacher leadership concept or a curriculum investment we've made, we certainly are open to that feedback and want that feedback from the board. So we'll ask for that at next Tuesday's meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Peterson to walk you through what a tier 3 analysis looks like, so you can see why we only do 3 of these a year, and then we add new ones at the end of the year. This give you a sense of how elaborate this kind of a study is, but this is going to give us a great sense of truly measuring the success of our freshman academy and determining if we want to do anything differently with that investment in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Peterson for the rest of the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions after she presents.
Thank you. As Dr. Jarrett mentioned, my name is Brooke Peterson, and I'll be discussing academic return on investment tonight. Tonight we have all of our core academic ROI team members with us. That includes Heidi Detman, Michelle Yar, Jeff Lowry, and myself. We also have Bridget French and Matt Bosberg, who have joined us. They've participated in this study as well. At its highest level, academic ROI allows us to study what works best for whom by analyzing student segments, student outcomes, and costs. This diagram shows the 10-step process that we take for every AROI analysis. You'll notice that there are 3 colors on this slide: green, yellow, and red. The green items are the items that we have accomplished and are pending final review. The yellow item is the item that is in progress, and the red is pending data. And so once we have data and are able to analyze, we will come back to you with that information. As Dr. Jarrett also just mentioned, we selected targets through a program selection rubric at the cabinet level. That was brought to you guys to narrow down to 3 initiatives. Again, those initiatives: Reading Horizons, Behavior Intervention, and Freshman Academy, which will be the focus of the discussion tonight. Our first actual step as an AROI team was to define specific definitions of success. These definitions need to include 3 things: program objectives, goals, and outcomes, metrics to measure each of them, and expected gains. Specifically, our 2 definitions are surrounding Freshmen on Track and student engagement. For Freshmen on Track, we anticipate hopefully seeing a percentage of freshmen that are on track to graduate increase by 10% as compared to the 2019-2020 school year. And as it pertains to student engagement, we hope to see a minimum of a score of 3 or higher for 80% of freshman students on a student engagement survey that is administered in the spring of the freshman year. Our next step was to design the plan. In any study, a comparison group should be created. For Freshmen on Track, for Freshman Academy rather, we decided to use an internal standard of year-over-year growth, since all high schools will be offering Freshman Academy next year. We also identified student segments by defining 3 to 4 characteristics that could help us to provide possible actionable insights into root causes for student successes or struggles. We selected attendance, PSAT, discipline, and student engagement. During this step, we also started to review the ability to collect data surrounding those points. As I just mentioned, these are the 4 characteristics selected for segmentation. During this next step, we determined comparison or baseline data and outcomes data for each item, and we also determined how to segment each characteristic. An example of this would be PSAT. The 8th grade PSAT score in the fall will be the baseline for incoming freshmen, and the spring PSAT score will be the outcomes data. The categories that we grouped these into are low, medium, and high propensity. Each of these categories then should be reviewed for whom is the program most successful. Our next focus was on outcomes data. Outcomes data is information that allows us to measure the effectiveness of the program based on the measures of success that we already defined. For Freshmen on Track, we'll look at common enrollment across the schools, course grades and credits, and failure rates. For student engagement, we will look at a student engagement survey that is administered 2 times in freshman year. We also are focusing on implementation data, which will help us to determine fidelity of implementation for important program components. We have determined 3 important components of the Freshman Academy, including small learning communities, freshman seminar class, and involvement in the school community as the most important program components for Freshman Academy. A specific way to review the data, the implementation data, is to look at the number of students that complete their student portfolio, or perhaps the number of students who decide to change academies after taking the freshman seminar class to determine how impactful the senior seminar or the freshman seminar class is and how well it's being implemented. We are currently mapping the cost. It's important to note that since the Freshman Academy is an established program, we are only measuring ongoing costs. And since the ongoing costs are very similar to the resources that would be required for a typical freshman year, we are only considering incremental costs above and beyond that of a typical freshman class. So far, we've identified things such as team lead stipends, academy coach salaries, part of Alignment Rockford cost, our contribution to Academy Expo, and some minimal transportation costs. Again, as a reminder, steps 7 through 10, we have not completed yet because data is not available. We will be looking at the incoming freshman class and we'll need to wait for that information to become available. But I will explain the steps so that you have an understanding of what to expect in the upcoming year. Program effectiveness will be evaluated. In doing so, we'll look at each segment to see who's benefiting and who's benefiting the most or who is struggling. And we will also analyze the program implementation to see if it had an impact on segments. We will analyze cost effectiveness by looking at all data, including the cost information, to determine an actual academic return on investment value at this time. Taking into account all possible information, including, of course, the program effectiveness and cost effectiveness, recommendations can be made on how to proceed with the program. A typical recommendation would be to keep or eliminate a program. But since we're doing a much more thorough AROI analysis, we are able to give deeper recommendations, such as expanding a successful program, targeting a program based on certain segments that are succeeding, reducing a program, or fixing problem areas within a program. Finally, we get to take action. This is where we'll share findings and recommendations with the district leaders, and decisions are made about how to proceed. At that point, a timeline is established, taking into account all new information for future analysis and changes, and we get back to work. As I mentioned before, we have the whole academic ROI team here to help answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, I'll open it up to the board for comments or questions, and just state your name so I can introduce you.
It's David Siegel.
Mr. Siegel.
I have just 2 questions. The first one is under the attendance segment. You have TBD listed. Is that due to the uncertainty of how this school year is going to look? Or have you just not determined what the attendance metrics will look like?
One of the things we're trying to account for is the exact segments because of the fact that we will only have 3 quarters worth of data. So initially we had planned for 4 quarters based on what a typical year attendance and absenteeism would take into account for. And we're trying to kind of reevaluate and see really what should 3 quarters look like. As you can see on that sheet, we'll compare quarters 1, 2, and 3 to quarters 1, 2, and 3. So we're just trying to figure out what those segments should look like.
Okay, thank you. And given that this is a tier 3 and is obviously a year-long grind for a lot of the people involved, is there any short cycle reporting that will come to the board for how progress looks, or do we just wait till some point after next year to hear this is how it went?
We're currently working on a calendar for how that would work, and reporting back on the tier 2s and tier 3s would look for both cabinet and the board. So I don't think it will be a year-long wait, but I don't exactly know what that looks like yet.
Okay.
David, just to give you some background on that, I think we are in the process of working with the board to build a calendar for both the weekly update as well as Ms. Peterson pointed out, as well as a board report schedule to use the superintendent's update like we're doing tonight, as well as committee time. What I can tell you is that tier 3s and tier 2s will certainly get way more time and the board's attention because of the importance that we've collectively identified them with. So I would think tier 3s in particular, we would be coming back significantly more often than once per year, but we haven't identified exactly what that is. Basically, when we have new information that is significant in the decision-making process, we're likely to share that on tier 3. So I would count on multiple times on tier 3s.
Thank you.
Okay, other board members?
This is Mike Connor.
Mr. Connor?
Yeah, you can just answer this briefly, but what is going to be the method of the actual data collection? Where are you going to physically house it? Who's responsible to gather all that data? And then really, what technique will we use for displaying or using the data for analysis?
If possible, I'll speak briefly to that, and then I may let Jeff Lowry chime in, who's our data research manager, who's specifically on the academic ROI projects to handle and manage all of the data. Data with all of our projects are going to be kind of coming at us from different directions depending upon what we're trying to get at. So with academic ROI, the one of the points is to not necessarily just look at the data that we have available, but also come up with unique ways, such as our student engagement survey that we'll be administering, to kind of get really to the bottom of what we think the most important components are. So with that, I'll let Jeff kind of speak in a little bit more detail if he has anything else to offer.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. Good evening. Yeah, for the time being, we're utilizing Excel and Google Sheets, and there's no issues with that. We're pulling the data from eSchool, College Board, and so forth, bringing it into Excel or Sheets. Long term, it would make sense to utilize the Decision Ed dashboard so that we can, pull that data in nightly and automate the presentation of it. Regardless of which system, it shouldn't be a problem to do simple copy and paste into presentation materials. So we don't anticipate any issues with whatever process we decide to use. As we're trying to get the Decision Ed dashboard up to speed, we want to probably give initial focus to make sure it aligns with the school scorecard. And so in the meantime, we can utilize Excel and Sheets to manipulate the data.
Any follow-up, Mr. Connor?
Sorry about that. Thought I was on mute.
Okay.
So in terms of presentation, is this mostly going to be shown, for example, to us as Excel? And will there be one central place where all data is kept for analytical purposes? For example, if we want to see it, or frankly, if there's a FOIA or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think we fleshed that out too much yet. The presentation, I would imagine, would just be, to put it simply, charts and graphs and bullet points to make our points. But as far as sharing data, yeah, we'll have to dive into that and see what really needs to be shared and what restrictions we'd have to overcome to share that.
Okay, and I have to assume that we're going to keep this data, we're going to look at consistent data elements and have that over time, obviously to support longitudinal studies, et cetera.
Right, correct.
Okay, other board member questions or comments?
Ken, this is Tim.
Go ahead, Tim.
So I just want to back up. So we're looking at the Freshman Academy, and I just don't know the background here. So are we currently doing Freshman Academies at all the high schools, or is this something we're now implementing? Because you had mentioned that we're going to do an internal, and so because we're all doing Freshman Academies already?
Right, Mr. Rollins, we selected 3 projects that we were already investing in with the idea to determine if we should expand, keep as is, segment and target different student segments, reduce what we're doing, fix it, or even ultimately eliminate it. So we can start new projects this way, but we thought it made the most sense to look backward on a position, a curriculum initiative, and this is kind of a combination of curriculum and also a structural initiative. So back last fall, the board was given a list of 6 items to choose from that we narrowed down as potential. And this was one of the 3 that the board selected. And now we're reporting back, showing you that the study is in place. And then we will then look at and do that analysis and ultimately come back to the board with, and the board will determine what next steps would be after we've analyzed all the tier 3s.
So I guess this goes back to then the methodology or how you draw any conclusions. So you don't have a control group because all of the high schools are currently doing Freshman Academies. Is that correct?
It's my understanding that all high schools will be doing Freshman Academy next year. I believe there's a small subset that are not actively engaged in it right now, but next year they will all be engaged in Freshman Academy. So you're correct. We don't have a true control group, and that is why we resorted to an internal year-over-year benchmark.
Well, if I can jump in, this is Bridget French. Auburn is not currently doing a Freshman Academy. They will next year, but this year they have not.
Okay.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around how we prove the AROI for Freshman Academy if we don't have a control group of people who haven't been in the Freshman Academy. I mean, a year-over-year increase doesn't really prove that the Freshman Academies are working, do they?
This is Heidi Detman. I'll jump in for just a moment. We had some extensive conversation over the last few months about how to measure the impact. And our current state right now is that we have the Freshman Academy in structure, but we all recognize that there are several places where we need to kind of tighten up our implementation and provide stronger guidance and support for implementation. So we can kind of look at our trend of freshmen on track as one data point that goes back multiple years. And what we expect as a team and in working with the Freshman Academy principals or the assistant principals is that with some tight support and implementation clarity, we can expect to see a significant jump in our freshman on track rate. So by fully being faithful to the academy model with freshman class, we're going to be able to see an increase in their achievement and their engagement, which were our 2 goals at the initial launch of the full academy model in our high schools.
I don't want to, well, maybe I'm seeming dense, or maybe I am just dense. So you're starting with the assumption that the Freshman Academies, if they were implemented correctly, would be what we should be doing. and that, so you're just looking for ways to implement them correctly. Is that really proving whether we should be doing freshman academies? Did DMG help you design this?
Yes, DMG helped us design it. They've been with us every step of the way. And of course, Freshman Academy is one component of our entire college and career academy model. And we're choosing kind of a micro focus with the Freshman Academy, partly because of the importance of being on track their freshman year, which gives them then the opportunity to fully participate as sophomores, juniors, and seniors in the rest of the career academy model. There are a few key features with the Freshman Academy that we'll be studying. One of them is the small group, the small learning community, or those teams of teachers that then create small cohorts of students within the freshman class. And we know that what research says is that when that happens and when that model is implemented with fidelity, we see an impact in student engagement and in freshman on track status. And so our study here is around how we are implementing this and supporting this model in our district to see those outcomes for our students.
Okay. So going back to the data collection, or how you determine whether this is effective, I guess I'm not clear on what your data collection is or what you're focusing on. If you go to outcomes data, or collect segment data, so you're looking at attendance, PSAT, discipline, and engagement. Those are the three things you're looking at?
That's correct. If I can step back in. So that's a key point with this AROI is the segments. And another way to think of the segments, and this is what DMG kind of guided us through, is think about what the root causes might exist for why this program may not be as successful or on track, so to speak. And that's why we landed on the segments we did. So for example, attendance. So we segment that based on the data that we had for the students after 8th grade, segment them into necessary cutoff marks. And then we compare and look at how each of those segments did on our measures of success, which are the on track, freshman on track, and engagement. So we're going to be doing a correlation between the segments and those measures of success. And then we can identify where maybe as a whole it looks like the program is doing well, but maybe it's not doing as well for certain segments. And then going to the step number 10 in the process, that's where we can tweak it and make adjustments so that that program can better serve those segments that didn't perform as well.
So your measures of success are freshman on track and student engagement, and that's what you're ultimately looking at as the outcome. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
But when you collect the data, you're collecting data just on these subsets of attendance, PSAT, discipline, and engagement. But then you'll be looking at those in connection with the actual freshman on track rate?
Yeah, that's right. So we can take each student and know which segment they exist in for each of the characteristics, attendance, behavior, PSAT, and engagement, and then compare that to how they performed on the two measures of success. And so we can do that across the entire group and make those large scale correlations, and then draw those insights and take appropriate action.
I guess what I don't want to miss here, we've had these discussions. We've had a discussion about the fact that one of our barriers to graduation is a large percentage of kids who are failing freshman algebra or freshman math, right?
Yeah.
And there was a discussion about, well, there's some other core courses that are being failed as well. So I guess one of my questions is, it doesn't seem like there's any focus on that kids are failing core courses, and that's why they're not on track. So I don't know if somebody wants to speak to that. I mean, you look at attendance, PSAT, discipline, and engagement, you're going to tell me that that's going to help us have kids pass their freshman algebra and freshman science and freshman ELA courses?
So, Mr. Rollins, the attempt at freshman on track is that ultimately the theory of action when this was rolled out is that all core classes would benefit from this idea of a common group of teachers working collectively to monitor that failure rate. And candidly, one of the reasons this was selected is we do have those problems. So while freshmen organizing according to freshman academies, even if done perfectly, may not be the sole solution to that, and it certainly won't be, we are attempting to isolate this particular variable that we've made a huge investment in time and dollars and determine whether we should keep making that investment. And so the student segments allow us to drill even deeper and see, well, hey, if we do this, is this a problem because we're just not doing it right? Or is this a problem because this just isn't a good solution for the Rockford Public Schools? And if you look at step 9, any program we put forth to this analysis, we are considering expanding it and keeping it, but we're also considering maybe tweaking how we talk about certain segments of students. We may reduce it, or we may even ultimately fix it or eliminate it. Those are all options that are going to be under consideration. But by no means does any one program or organizational structure going to single-handedly fix all of our problems. This is just an attempt to say, hey, this was supposed to help with our failure rate in all courses, and our failure rate for freshmen isn't where we want it to be. So we really want to look heavily under the hood here and do some pretty strong analysis to determine where the breakdown is and how much of it has to do with how the freshman academies are actually functioning and what their role can be in increasing passing rates for freshmen.
Okay. Any other board member comments or questions?
This is Jude. Why don't we
Go
have
ahead,
a
Jude.
freshman? Why don't we have a freshman academy at Auburn? I thought we were full fidelity across all the high schools. Why don't we have one?
A few years ago, Auburn made a decision to eliminate their freshman academy to see if that would allow them to have more fidelity to the model, because they have 2 additional academies. It can be difficult with allocations to have so many academies. So in essence, they would have 7. And so they wanted to see if having 6 would be a solution for them that would work. And I think that they've determined that a freshman academy will be something that will help them, because part of the purpose of the SLC, or the smaller learning community, is that they can talk about those student failures, talk about students that are failing integrated math 1 or may need social emotional support, and really be able to ensure that every student has a place and every student belongs, and that every student's failure in any class is being addressed.
So short of having this ROI piece in the study, and had they determined this and they were going to bring it back on board, or did that happen because they were told to participate in this?
No, we have been working with Ms. Keffer and, prior to her being at Auburn, Ms. Hawkins, and strongly encouraging them to bring it back. And I think we all worked together with Mr. Vosberg to determine that it would be a good time to bring it back to address their freshman on track rate.
Yeah, Auburn does have the greatest challenge with their freshman on track rate in the district, and so and with the leadership change, Mrs. Keffer thought it was a good move to attempt to make this kind of investment.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, June.
So what will be different for the freshmen at Auburn when they get the academy?
So a few things will be different. One, they will be in a college and career readiness course that will allow them to explore academies and their interests. They will have teachers that are solely dedicated to them. So previously, they had to make a decision in 8th grade as to what academy they were going to be in. And then their freshman year, they could change. And that was essentially putting them into almost sophomore level classes as freshmen, that the first course in a 3-course sequence is typically taken by a 10th grader. The Freshman Academy provides, not only that freshman course that helps them understand their high school trajectory and planning. But a freshman team now with a freshman principal, freshman counselor will truly provide them the social emotional support that they need by ensuring that no students are falling through the cracks. And, you know, previously the freshmen were sort of spread out among the academies. And I think, you know, with Ms. Keffer's leadership, we've discussed the fact that, you know, Auburn freshmen have some social emotional support needs that could be best addressed by giving them a little bit more attention.
Thank you.
I guess I was surprised when you said Auburn didn't have a freshman academy. Now, is that something that had to come past the board, or is that something that we gave leeway that they had they didn't need the permission or guidance of the board? How did that come to pass? Can you hear me?
Yeah, if someone else could perhaps.
Yeah, I can jump in. It was a site-based decision that was made by the building principal with the desire to connect a similar model, because they have a freshman through senior year model with Kappa and Gifted, and there was inconsistency. So that was why it was contemplated and considered. But when you look at what has happened to their on-track rate, it's been consistently challenging. And so Mrs. Keffer, when she came in, decided to go in a different direction from the previous principal. Again, this decision to invest in freshman academies was made many, many years ago. And what we're doing to bring it forward here is not to try to resell everybody on the decision, but rather this is an attempt to really look deeply under the hood and make sure this is the right investment. And is this because we're implementing it wrong, or is it just the wrong approach? So that was why the board ultimately selected this. This is not we're not trying to relitigate the decision from 7 years ago. What we're letting the board know is where this can be really good is it can let the board and the administration truly, with great discipline, decide if we are getting a good return on investment for something. And we wouldn't have brought freshman academies forward if we thought it was just doing everything we want it to be. The reason the board and administration agreed on this one is because our freshman on track rate is not where it should be. And it's something we have not seen the kind of improvement on that we would like to. And we want to attack this one variable at a time. We did consider the math sequence as an option, but ultimately collectively decided last fall with the board's input to decide to do that one at a later date. You will find that, for example, the new math sequence for high school is on the tier 2 list, and we can certainly add any of those course sequences that impact freshmen to if we want to add any of those to tier 2, we can certainly do that, and potentially could be future tier 3s. But I just want to be clear, our purpose is not to kind of, hey, should we still be doing freshman academies? That will come after the study. We want to make as intelligent and informed of a decision as we can about what changes need to be made or improvements need to be made to this huge investment we're making in terms of staff time, student time, and not getting the results we want right now.
And if I could just add for one moment, you know, one of the most critical steps in academic ROI in the process is taking your time to define success and ensuring that there are no assumptions about what success means and how we're going to measure it. And that's partly why we landed on these 3 critical projects, is because it gives us an opportunity to come back up from our implementation every day and ask, are we all clear on what we're trying to accomplish and how we're defining successful implementation? And then bring people who are in the work daily closest to the table to say, help us define success from your lens, and then what support do you need in order to be successful in this implementation? And so we've had some great meetings with the Freshman Academy principals, hearing from their perspective, and we look forward to bringing them together as a professional learning community throughout this study over the next year, to be able to be monitoring what's going well in each individual school for different segments of students, so that we can replicate those best practices more quickly from school to school.
And I just want to reinforce the importance of what Mrs. Detman said about defining success on the front end. I think what we have not done a good job of as a district when we've rolled out new initiatives or studied the current success of initiatives is agree collectively in a very narrow and focused way what the most important definition of success is. And so that is our attempt here to do this. And I think that freshman on track rate, while not the only way to measure the success of a program, is certainly a glaring weakness at the district-wide right now. We aren't where we want to be in any of our high schools right now. And this is something we are doing in all of our high schools. And we either need to do it better, or we need to come up with different ways to attack this problem of freshman on track rate and attendance.
So,
This is Kent. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, I mean, I kind of hear kind of some different things here, and I would hope that an AROI analysis would take nothing for granted, including whether or not this is the correct program, and that we would be looking at whether this is the correct program.
We are. Yep.
So let me ask the question this way: tell me what outcome you have from this process that leads you to conclude that maybe we shouldn't be doing a freshman academy.
If we continue to not get results on freshman on track rate or attendance, and we see that we're doing it faithfully, that will be the back and forth on this. But when you look at that step 9 of drawing insight, we have to have integrity when we choose to study something. We have to say, hey, if it's truly not working, we have to consider fixing or even eliminating the program. That has to be on the table. Otherwise, there's not integrity in this process.
And I agree with that. And my concern is what I heard at various points was this is the correct program, and we just need to see if we're implementing it.
Nope. We obviously believe that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have made the investment originally or attempted to do this analysis. But no, the data is that's why it's so important to define success first, because what we believe needs to be trumped ultimately by what the study tells us by the end of the year. And that's why being clear about what success is takes the subjectivity of people's bias out of it. That's what we're really attempting to do a better job of as an organization. And this is a really tough one to do first, but we felt, and so did the board, that we needed to pick something with some real high stakes here, something that really mattered, because this has been a huge investment of time and effort. And we want to either fix this or find a way to go in a different direction if we truly can't fix it.
Okay, I have a question. I think it's for Brooke, but obviously getting to step 10 is that's where you make decisions about what you wanted, what action you're going to take or whatever. Do you have a time frame target that you've set for this project to get to step 10?
So obviously we'll have to wait for the comparison data, the outcomes data to come due. So we'll need, in order for the full analysis to take place, we'll need to wait until about this time next year to start really processing that data to be able to draw. So we need to wait, like I said, the attendance and the discipline data, we'll do quarter 3 8th grade to quarter 3 9th grade as the comparison. But things like the PSAT will take a little bit longer for those things to come in and for us to analyze.
Okay. Any other board comments or questions?
So this is Jude. So your PSAT, when do you get those results?
The spring PSAT results generally come in preliminarily in June on a student-by-student basis, which gives us an opportunity to start analyzing the data. They don't come back in school reports until the fall, but we get student-by-student data that we can work with over the summer.
And so you expect, with regard to Ken's question, to be able to come back to us with your information in July next year? Is that what you're saying?
I think at this point that would be a rough estimate. We'll have to make sure everything is a little topsy-turvy with all standardized assessments, and the fall administration of the PSAT 8 is also in conversation. So I just want to make sure that we have that context. But at this point, that would be a good estimation for when we'd be able to share our first look at the data.
Right, and we don't want this to go beyond multiple academic years, right?
Well, that is my concern, is that it
So,
does.
so I hear
And-
what the board is saying, and obviously that would not even be in question if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic in terms of disrupting some of the baseline data. So we will do everything we can to deliver clear conclusions at the end of next year, so that we can make future decisions. The problem is going to be if the sample gets skewed because we have significant disruptions in the academic year, we'll have to go back and forth with the board and determine if we feel like this is a good if this is a good year to measure. If we end up with 3 months where students are out because of in remote learning, is that the year we want to base the decision on? Obviously, as a general rule, we wouldn't want to be introducing this in a year where the sample could be so compromised. But at the end of the day, we also would need to move forward as much as possible. And we're certainly planning on having some really clear analysis by the end of the school year next year.
And
So-
just to further that point, we're not launching a project and then leaving it until a year from now. We'll be
Right.
closely monitoring our implementation and our lead indicators all the way through the year. So we should have some really good data all along the way that lets us know how we're doing. And then our final data review helps us really add that nuance to our analysis in terms of for which groups of students did the right pieces fit in order to advance them. So that's
So I just want to say that I'm astounded that a school with a population of students who really need help and support, that we got rid of Freshman Academy because the kids who already have support, most likely because they're in a special program where their parents and they have gone through the effort of being either in Kappa or gifted. And we've got all the rest who just were left floundering because these other ones had their academies already and those kids got left behind. And I think that whoever made that decision, that sounds pretty disappointing. So I'm glad, for nothing else, that at least they'll have that support.
Yeah, and this is going to be, what's exciting to me is we're going to have an opportunity to not only do this for this particular project, this is just one of 3. We also are going to do a deep dive on Reading Horizons, as well as the efficacy of one of our core positions that many of our schools are investing in, the behavior intervention specialist. So we'll be doing 3 of these next year, and we're going to learn from all 3. And all 3 of them are going to have these same options on the table at the end of them. And then the ideal, this is going to build a discipline in our organization in 2 ways. 1, we will look backwards on existing investments, but 2, and we can't do this with everything. We're limited to 3 because of how, as you can see, how time intensive this is. You're doing a really deep dive, but we will be able to eventually pick 3 new projects, more than likely that we're going to elevate from tier 2. So I do want everyone to take a hard look at that tier 2 list. I resent it to you already, and really excited to have a conversation with you next week about, all right, are we missing anything? Because we are going to study those tier 2 items as well. It won't be this elaborate. We aren't doing the full study, but we are going to keep those in front of the board and be measuring and seeing how we're doing on those, and reporting on those investments. And those will be the future tier 3s most likely. It also helps us build that discipline into being clear about what outcomes are when we bring new items forward as well. So a lot of exciting things can come from this as we build this discipline into our organization, and ultimately, hopefully, focuses us better rather than just throwing new ideas out before we've fully measured the efficacy of the current ones.
Okay, so more to come.
Lots more.
Very good. Yep, okay. Well, we'll move on now to our action items. The action item for tonight is the kitchen consultant proposal that was submitted by Mr. Phillips. Is there a motion and a second to approve item 13A?
So moved, Mike.
Moved by Mr. Connor. Or second?
Second. Anthony.
Second, Mr. Siegel or Anthony Dixon. Any comments or questions or discussion? Not, I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the kitchen consultant proposal.
Mr. Scrivano,
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch,
Yes.
Mr. Siegel,
Yes.
Mr. Connor,
Yes.
Ms. Stanford,
Yes.
Mr. Dixon,
Yes.
Mr. Rollins.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay, we are now on to new business, and Mrs. Yar is going to present our first item, which is a resolution extending board policy 4.10's budget deadline. Michelle.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, I'm just bringing forward this resolution. Typically, school districts will approve their budgets in September. That is a state requirement. We do pass it early in June, so that's before we've closed out the financials. We haven't done our year-end entries. That usually isn't a problem because our assumptions have been very good, but with all the pandemic, all the fluid revenue, there's been a lot of changes. So we talked about in the last budget presentation that if evidence-based funding came in flat, we would dip into fund balance basically by $9 million. Thinking that we wouldn't have word on that, or we weren't sure if we'd have word on that, but we did get word last week that that is where it's coming in at. It is at the 155 million, so that is flat. So we do have an unbalanced budget at this point of the $9 million that we talked about before. I'd like to extend this so we might learn more as we go. First of all, we don't know what school looks like in the fall. So we don't know that. So we might have some savings, we might have some adjustments we can make based on what school looks like, but we really don't know what our business looks like at this point. It's a little hard to develop a budget and have it accurate when we don't really know what our business model looks like. Also, on May 15th, we had our last payment for CPPRT, which is a corporate personal and property replacement tax. That was a decrease of $1.4 million from where their estimates are. So how this works is they provide an estimate to us. Illinois Department of Revenue says, here's your estimate for the year. And then, sometimes it's up. It's been up the last several years from their estimate. But this year is, we found out the last payment that now we've been shorted by $1 million, basically. They could have increased expenses and they do a true up at the end. We don't have a reason why yet, but everyone's experienced the same thing where there's a decrease of about 35% of your previous payment. So that was one item too that's very fluid. So really, there's not a real downside to pushing it out and having a better look at what the economy might look like when things are turned back on, which will happen very shortly as limited pace. So in 3 months, we will probably have better estimates on that. Alternatively, we could pass the budget as is, and we just had the public hearing, so we're on track to do that. Everything would stay as is in the tentative budget. There could be some minor adjustments unless we hear more, but we're changing this every couple of days, basically, right now with new information that we're learning. So we have it at $9 million, like I had mentioned. So that's an option too, but I really don't see a downside to extending it, but we could pass it with our June deadline. But I'm asking for it my recommendation is to extend.
Okay, any discussion? Okay, hearing none, this will come back to us for a vote at our next board meeting. Next is Mrs. French is going to talk to us about the donation of a police squad car.
Good evening again, everyone. Sorry about that. My name is Bridget French. I'm the Executive Director of College and Career Readiness. And the City of Rockford, the Rockford Police Department specifically, has been very interested in donating a retired squad car for the use of our public safety pathway courses. As you may know, we have retired, or in some cases active, police officers, lieutenants, or detectives teaching courses in our public safety pathway. So we've developed a really good relationship with the Rockford Police Department. And our Director of Career and Technical Education and I have been working on ways to incorporate the use of a squad car in the public safety, criminal investigation, and criminal justice classes. The value of the car is $4,000. We will keep the car at Sterling Holly when it's not being used. Each high school will keep the car for 6 to 7 weeks, approximately. The ancillary cost of having the car is $1,500 in insurance, just for driving it from one school to the other or to Sterling Holly to a school. With that, I am welcome to take any questions you might have.
Any questions or comments for Mrs. French?
Yeah, I had a simple question.
Okay,
It
Mr.
was just
Dixon.
regarding, yeah, Anthony Dixon speaking. Just regarding the car, I guess. So it's for when I read over it, it was saying it's for a pathway. And so we have a legal, or what type of pathway was that? Law pathway? I missed it.
It's called public safety, and there's an intro class. There is a criminal justice class, and then the third course is called Intro to Crime Scene Investigation, and that's a dual credit class where students that complete the class with a C or higher receive college credit. And so that class is the primary class that this would be used in. So any student that is interested in their freshman year, if they choose public safety as a pathway, then they would enroll in these 3 courses sophomore, junior, senior year.
Okay, I just thought it was kind of fascinating, and just kind of wanted to back around a little bit more information about that. And what I was thinking when I was reading it was that I think it's good because you're going to have some police officer or some detective teaching a class or having some type of background in the actor with the kids. And I thought that was a good way for kids to get along or have some type of relationship with the officers, cops, with not a negative background. It's just a positive, this is what we kind of do. And just, so that was my background. That was my thought on it anyways.
Yeah, it's been a really great addition to all of our high schools, and has built a lot of trust between the police department and our schools. So
Great. Any other discussion?
And this is Jude.
Go ahead, Jude.
2 things. Besides the insurance, obviously, there'll probably be some upkeep with the vehicle. I don't know who gets responsible for that since it's moving between buildings and we have site-based budget. I still don't understand how it's being used in the classroom. I mean, do they go out and look at what's in a police car? Or, I mean, it's not that I'm against it. I just don't get it.
Okay.
yeah, so first of all, the expenses will come out of my budget, the CCR budget. It won't come out of the school's budget. And the other ancillary costs, gasoline, will come out of my budget. And then we've also talked to our automotive teachers about potentially using the car, if anything were to happen to it, as a learning experience for those students as well. As far as how it will be used in the classroom, it's been stripped of its markings on the outside, but otherwise everything is intact. And we have found that whenever we have like an exploration fair at a school and a police officer or the police department brings in a squad car, students are fascinated by it. So we have built in some project-based learning units where they will use certain components of the car as a part of their lesson. And I'm happy to share the specifics of the curriculum with you if you would like.
Okay, any other discussion? Not, this will come back to us at our board meeting on June 9th for a vote. Next is Mrs. Lawrence is going to talk to us about special ed private and residential placement contract for Hope Learning Academy.
Hello, my name's Mike Ram, the Director of Special Ed.
Okay.
And I'll be presenting tonight for the Hope Learning Academy.
Okay.
So good evening. Today I'm bringing forward a contract for a residential facility contract for Hope Learning Academy. There's a satellite in Springfield, Illinois, and in Chicago. We currently do not have a contract with them. We haven't had one in the past. So we would have to move forward with bringing a contract to board. This contract is for one student that was placed by parents through a family care grant, which is a state-funded grant. And the grant funds the room and board in the district, pays for the tuition. So since we've never had a contract with Hope, we are asking for approval for us to use them.
Okay. I understand this is in Springfield, Illinois, is the location of the academy?
So it's in Springfield, Illinois. There are satellites in Chicago, but where the specific student is in Springfield, I do believe. Yes, sir.
Okay. Other comments or questions for Mike?
This
Mrs.
is
McCullough?
Jude. Are we still responsible for providing transportation and lodging for a parent to visit their child if they're more than so many hours away from Rockford? And is there a reason that we can't have the student at a closer location? Their family must be in the district, right? If we're paying this.
The family lives in the district. The student was currently going to a therapeutic day site. Due to circumstances outside of the school where something occurred somewhere else, the family got access to a family care grant. What I understand of the process is the parents then have the ability to look at a list of sites that have open beds. Then the parent can pick a site. We've had students go to, Maryville, Alton, Illinois. They get to pick where they go. Then the student then attends that school for, I do believe, 6 months. And then there's a discussion and meetings to see whether the student can come back out of there. I've never had any experience with a family providing room and board for them or transportation. Usually the student goes to wherever they go, and then the student stays there for the time period, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. Then the student comes back after the student has progressed. I've been doing this for 2 years. I haven't had a parent ask to go, if they want to visit. I do believe they can go and visit their students, but usually the student goes there and gets whatever help that's needed. And then the student comes back after a set amount of time and after meetings have occurred.
Yeah, there is something. I don't know, Lori, if you're still, your picture wasn't up, but because we had an arsonist who couldn't get into any of the local schools or the state schools, and I forget where do you guys remember that?
I think it was either
Nebraska.
Kansas or Nebraska, one of those two.
Right. So then once a month or something like that, twice a year, I don't remember. We had to pay for parents' transportation and lodging so they could visit their student. So I was just curious about that. It's great that, the parents have this grant, but to be able to choose schools anywhere that they want to go, there are sometimes auxiliary costs.
Yes, and by law, we would have to provide certain transportation and lodging.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? If not, this will come back to the board for a vote on June 9th. And then our next item is Mr. Zediker on the contract with Unemployment Tracker for unemployment insurance claims administration and cost management. Mr. Zediker.
Thank you, Mr. Scrivano. This is a new contract that we would like to engage in. We currently work with NSN, who provides our consultant work for the administration of unemployment claims. We have been with NSN since 2011. And we would like to propose to move our business from NSN to the unemployment tracker. This is a cheaper option for the district for the unemployment claims, as well as the platform they provide allows us to have additional reporting mechanisms built in, as well as having more access to data and reports for us as a district. The cost of the contract over 3 years is estimated to be just over $20,000.
Any discussion or questions for Mr. Zediker? Okay, this will come back to us for a vote by the board on June 9th. We are out now on to board member or administration action steps. I didn't record any for myself or the board, other than, for administration, there's going to be follow-up on the return on investment reports. And unless anyone has any other business, we'll take a motion.
Mr. Scribano, I
Yep.
did just ask, I sent an email to the board to just take a look at that tier 2 list prior
Oh, yes.
to next Tuesday's meeting, so that you can reach out to me if you have any questions, and certainly just think about suggestions that you would want to
Okay.
add to the list potentially, or
Okay.
if there's something that you may want to remove from the list because you don't think it's worthy of being elevated to that level.
Okay. So board members, if you will review that email that Aaron sent on the level 2 recommendations for AOI. All right, if not, I'll take a motion for adjournment.
So
moved.
Moved by Mr. Connor. Is there a second? There is a second. All right. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned at 8:35 p.m.